Hi, I'm Daryl Schrader, Director of Systems Integration for Western IM, and you're here today for Classification 101, the Basics. This is the first in a series on classification for our Learn With Us sessions. I'll be covering basic concepts in classification and classification systems. Additional sessions will deal more specifically with records management topics in classification. But let's start with basics today and build a foundation. Before we begin our session, let's start with a disclaimer. I am not a records manager. Classification is a very broad, interdisciplinary field of study. It's been claimed that classifying things is a fundamental function of the human mind, intrinsic to the use of language. So I'll be taking a very broad perspective on classification and not restricting the conversation to how to group business objects together. I'll be bringing in concepts from information theory, which provides a mathematical foundation for doing classification, concepts from computing science, which formalize object models, and content management practices from groups such as AIM. We'll touch on things specific to records management, but hopefully I can expand your understanding of classification. So with that out of the way, let's jump right in. Let's start with a history lesson. I promise there won't be a test. Records management goes back to the ancient Sumerians around 3200 BC, and managing paper records really takes off after Gutenberg invents the printing press around 1440 AD. Formal thinking in classification goes back to Plato and Aristotle around 400 BC. The mathematical underpinnings of information theory only go back to the early 1900s, and concepts of classification in computer science start around 1960. Management of electronic records only gets underway around 1980. So what's the point of this trip down memory lane? It's to remind us that records management has a long history and that the concepts it uses are time-tested. But applying these concepts to electronic records is a relatively new thing. We need to be open to different ways of applying proven concepts in new situations. Things that worked for managing clay tablets in Sumeria may not be totally applicable to managing email. So what is this thing called classification? Basically, classification is a way for humans to deal with very large numbers of things. You may be able to keep in mind the half dozen or so individual trees on your yard, but you can't keep in mind the thousands of different trees in a forest. Instead, we group all of the trees together in a concept of tree. Now, instead of thinking about all the different individual trees, we can think of just one construct that applies to all of them. Classification proceeds in several steps. First is abstraction, where we stop thinking of the specific individual objects and instead construct a mental image of the object. Then we generalize the images, discarding the unimportant differences and focusing on the important features common to all of them. This gives us a single image that corresponds to each member of the class or type. It should also give us rules by which we can determine if any specific object belongs to that class or type. We can also create parameters, which are differences between members of the class that are important. For example, we may want to note the location or species of a specific tree, but we probably don't want to know how many leaves a specific tree has. For each class or type, we create a set of parameters that hold important information. It's important to note that there is no right or wrong way to classify things. Some ways of classifying things may be more useful than others. For example, we can classify emails by how many characters are in the subject line and group together all emails with 43 characters in the subject line. There's nothing specifically wrong with this, but we are unlikely to find it particularly useful. We should also note that humans are really good at classification. So good that we naturally use many different classifications and constantly switch between them as they become more or less useful. In order to deal with this, we introduce the concept of a classification system. Since people naturally use many different classifications, we create a classification system that is a single set of classes that covers all of the objects in a particular field of interest. A typical field of interest may be all of the business records for a particular organization. With one classification system, we can get everyone to think about the objects in the same way. We can have consistency when different people perform the same task, or when the same person performs that task over different time frames. We can record the rules for membership in a particular class in scope notes so that the rules don't gradually drift over time. It's important to note that just making a set of common classifications is insufficient. People have to know about them and interpret them consistently. This means education and refresher courses. In essence, a classification system is a communication tool used to get all of the users on the same page. We should also note what a classification system is not. It is not a browse structure. A classification system groups together similar types of things and makes explicit the differences between those things. A browse structure facilitates findability. It provides a start point, asks the question, "What are you looking for?" and then presents options. Once a choice is made, the process is repeated, presenting new options. A series of these choices gradually restricts the possibilities until a reasonable number of results are obtained. A browse structure, by its very nature, is hierarchical, while a classification system does not have to be. A browse structure implies some level of classification in order to group together options, but a classification system does not necessarily imply a structure that facilitates browsing. Records managers often attempt to implement their classification systems as browse structures, forcing users to file and find objects according to the defined classes. This often results in frustration for both the records manager and their users because they are attempting to make one concept perform two different functions. We can emphasize the difference between classification and browsing by using two different types of grouping. Grouping items together based on classification uses a type of object known as a class, and grouping items together for browsing convenience uses a type of object known as a folder. For example, let's consider invoices. We group all the invoices together in an invoice class. We also want to group invoices together by fiscal year, and it's convenient to group all of the invoices from a specific vendor together. But invoices from different vendors aren't different kinds of thing, so we wouldn't want to make different classes for them. Instead, we put all of the invoices into one invoice class, and then use folders to group together invoices from each vendor. We then use more folders to group together vendor folders for a specific fiscal year. In this way, we can browse to an invoice we are looking for without unnecessarily multiplying the number of classes. At this point, let's have a little side discussion about folders. Traditionally, computer storage systems didn't have classes, just folders, and they only had one piece of metadata, the file or folder name. In order to assign other metadata, we used folders. Everything that had a certain metadata value went into a particular folder. Multiple metadata values were handled by using multiple levels of folders. This worked, but it could lead to very cumbersome folder structures. It can also lead to confusion, where the intent of the folder is unclear. Is this folder grouping together the same kind of things, or things with similar metadata, or is it trying to help me choose what I am looking for? If you migrate to a content management system that allows for assigning metadata, you may be able to eliminate some folder structures by assigning metadata values directly onto objects. Now, back to classification systems. If a classification system isn't a browse structure, then what is it? What kinds of classification systems are there? One kind of classification system is an index, which tells you where to find something. An index may be alphabetical, where the names of the classes are alphabetically ordered. An index may be numeric, where each class is assigned a number, like a student number or an employee number, and then organized in numeric order. An index may be chronological, ordered by date, or it may be ordered by physical location. Traditionally, classification systems for records management were usually physical indexes, where the classes were used to identify where a physical folder was located in a file room. Another kind of classification system is a taxonomy. The word taxonomy literally means ordering laws. Taxonomies typically emphasize the rules that specify what objects belong in a class. They are often linked to naming conventions, where the name of the class implies how to find it in the classification system. The classic taxonomy is the Linnaean system used to classify organisms. Then there are ontologies. The word ontology is literally talking about being. Ontologies emphasize the nature or essence of a thing. What is it? Object models in computer programming are typically ontologies. Finally, there are teleologies, literally end reason, which emphasize the end use of the object. What is this going to be used for? What purpose does it serve? Once we've defined the classes, they can be organized in different ways. Since a picture is worth 1,000 words, let's go to the blackboard and draw some pictures. This is a picture of a flat structure. The blue circles are classes. There are no relationships between the classes. They exist independently. There is no defined start point, a point from which you can start your journey to other classes. A flat structure typically requires some sort of search mechanism to find what you are looking for. For this reason, a flat structure is typical of an index-type classification system. Flat structures can be used with quite large numbers of classes if you have an effective index. For example, if you assign an ID number, like a student number or an employee number, you can quickly find that class even if you have thousands or hundreds of thousands of classes. Here is a hierarchical structure. A hierarchy is a tree-like structure that starts with one node at the top. We can then add child nodes underneath the top node, connected to the top node through links. Additional child nodes can then be linked to the first level, and this can be repeated down to as many levels as needed. Hierarchies can be used with any type of classification system. This is a network structure. Like a flat structure, there is no defined start node. You can start at any node in the network. Like a hierarchy, nodes are connected through links, but the links do not form a strict parent-child relationship. There is no tree structure. Any node can be connected to any other node in the network. Networks may be more amenable to changes, since a new node can be added and linked to other similar nodes without considering how it fits in a structure. Let's take a minute to look at the kinds of classification systems that have been used in records management. Traditionally, records managers used subject classification, which is a kind of ontology. As you remember, an ontology classes things by what they are, the subject matter. The classes would be organized in a hierarchy, often using a block numeric type format. Overlaid on this would be a physical index, which mapped the classes to a physical location in a file room. More recently, if we can call 50 years recently, records managers have used functional classification. This is a teleology, where the classes are determined by how an object is used, the business function or activity that it supports. We can observe that organizations are often structured around business functions as well. This means that a functional classification system often mimics the corporate structure of the organization. This has two implications. First, if there is a reorganization of the corporate structure, this often calls for a reorganization of the classification system. Second, if an organization does not map the corporate structure around business functions and activities, there will not be an obvious fit between the corporate structure and the classification system. Now, we've talked about a lot of different things, but where does it all get us? Well, let's talk about the elephant in the room. SharePoint. You may have it in your organization under different names: Microsoft 365, Office 365, Teams, or SharePoint. Whatever name it is marketed under, it is the same technology under the hood, and it all works the same way. And how it works is going to have implications for classifying information. First, SharePoint has a networked architecture. As we've seen, classification systems for records management are often hierarchical, so there may not be an obvious way to map between SharePoint and an existing classification system. Second, SharePoint can assign metadata directly to files, so there is no need to assign metadata indirectly through folders. SharePoint prefers to expose files through filters and views that work on directly assigned metadata, rather than using folder trees. If you're used to implementing classification systems as browse structures using folders, it will be difficult to do the same thing in SharePoint. Also, SharePoint uses delegation in a distributed architecture. Particularly as implemented in Teams, SharePoint expects to be used by independent, cross-functional teams. This means that it may be difficult to create a standardized view of data across an organization, which is basically what a classification system is. Because SharePoint does not emphasize traditional corporate structures, it may be difficult to map SharePoint data to classes that are organized around business functions. Notwithstanding these difficulties, it is possible to manage your information in SharePoint. You may have to make some changes, but the basic principles of classification and records management still apply within SharePoint. That brings us to the end of what I have time for today. So let's do our executive summary. Hopefully, the characters on screen don't remind you of the executives in your organization. But these are the points that you want to emphasize when your boss asks you what you learned today. First, classification is about grouping things together to reduce complexity. If you want to group two things together, ask yourself, is there a difference? And then, does it make a difference? If there is no significant difference, then the two things can go into one class. Second, a classification system is not a browse structure. Classes organize different types of things, while folders are used to organize things for findability. And finally, a plan is nothing. Planning is everything. A classification system is a communication tool, and so it has to be communicated to people. Expect to spend most of your time telling people about it, listening to what they have to say, and then using that feedback to make changes. That's a very high-level overview of classification and classification systems. Obviously, we haven't covered this in any great detail. For those of you on our Learn With Us session, there will be a Q&A after the video. If you are watching this video on your own, you can direct your questions to me at the contact information below. That's it for this video, and I hope you have a great day.